Berlin was no longer a capital. It was a collapsing fortress of smoke, rubble, and desperation. By April 1945, the Third Reich was not fighting to win anymore. It was fighting to delay the inevitable. Soviet artillery thundered day and night, inching closer to the heart of the city, while what remained of Germany's leadership retreated underground into the Führer bunker. Deep beneath the ruins, Adolf Hitler presided over the final chapter of his regime, cut off from reality, yet still issuing orders to armies that no longer existed. Communications were breaking down across all fronts. Entire divisions had been wiped out, others were fragmented, leaderless, or retreating without coordination. Reports arriving in Berlin painted a grim picture: bridges destroyed, supply lines severed, and soldiers abandoning positions not out of cowardice, but because there was simply nothing left to defend. Fuel shortages crippled armored units, ammunition was scarce. Even the most loyal officers began to realize that the war was lost. Inside the bunker, the atmosphere was tense, claustrophobic, and increasingly detached from reality. Maps were still spread across tables, but the lines drawn on them no longer reflected the truth. Hitler continued to move imaginary divisions, ordering counterattacks that would never happen. His generals, once confident and assertive, now spoke cautiously, often telling him only what he wanted to hear. The fear inside the room was no longer just about defeat, it was about facing Hitler himself. Yet even as Berlin crumbled under Soviet pressure, another fear lingered in the minds of German commanders: the Western Front. While the Red Army closed in from the east, Allied forces were advancing rapidly from the west, cutting through Germany with alarming speed. Cities that were expected to hold for weeks were falling in days. Defensive lines collapsed almost as quickly as they were established, and among the Allied commanders leading this charge, one name kept resurfacing in German reports, briefings, and whispered conversations. This was not just another general. To many in the German high command, he represented something far more dangerous than overwhelming numbers or superior equipment. He represented unpredictability, speed, relentless pressure. His movement didn't follow the patterns they had studied for years. He attacked where he wasn't expected, moved faster than seemed possible, and exploited weaknesses before they could even be recognized. In the bunker, discussions about the Western Front became increasingly urgent. Officers brought fragmented intelligence, rapid advances, sudden breakthroughs, units outflanked before they could regroup. The situation was chaotic, and in chaos, fear spreads quickly. Some commanders began to question not just how long they could hold, but whether they were facing an opponent they truly understood. Hitler, despite his deteriorating condition, remained intensely focused on control. He demanded explanations for every retreat, every lost position, but explanations were becoming harder to provide. The reality was simple: Germany no longer had the capacity to respond effectively. The war had shifted beyond strategy. It had become a race against collapse. As Soviet forces tightened their grip on Berlin, the sounds of war grew closer. Explosions shook the bunker walls. Dust fell from the ceilings. The outside world was being erased, street by street. And yet inside those underground rooms, conversations continued, not just about survival, but about the enemies who had brought them to this point. Some generals spoke of the overwhelming force of the Soviets. Others focused on the precision and coordination of British and American operations. But there were moments, quiet, tense moments, when the discussion turned to a single figure whose reputation seemed to grow with every passing report. Because in the final days of the Third Reich, as everything collapsed, fear was no longer just about defeat. It was about how that defeat had been delivered: fast, aggressive, and unstoppable. And somewhere beyond the ruined cities and broken lines, an American general was advancing with a momentum that Germany could no longer contain. In a war defined by massive armies and global strategy, it was a dangerous realization. Sometimes the actions of one commander could ripple across an entire front, turning order into chaos. And as Berlin burned, that realization lingered in the minds of those who remained underground, waiting for an end they knew was coming. Long before his name echoed through German war rooms with unease, George S. Patton had already built a reputation that set him apart from nearly every other Allied commander. He wasn't just aggressive, he believed aggression itself was the key to victory. To Patton, hesitation was the enemy, speed was survival, and momentum was a weapon just as powerful as tanks or artillery. From the very beginning of his campaigns, Patton made one thing clear: he would not fight a slow war. In North Africa, during the North African Campaign, he took over a shaken American force that had just suffered a humiliating defeat. Discipline was poor, morale was low, but Patton transformed it almost overnight. He enforced strict standards, demanded constant readiness, and pushed his troops to move faster, think faster, and strike harder. Within weeks, the same units that had retreated in confusion were advancing with confidence. But it wasn't just discipline that defined him, it was his instinct for movement. Patton believed that a moving army was a winning army. He refused to let his forces sit still, even when supply lines were stretched thin. To him, stopping meant giving the enemy time to recover, and that was something he would never allow. This philosophy became even more visible during the invasion of Sicily, part of the larger Allied invasion of Sicily. While other commanders followed more cautious plans, Patton pushed his forces forward at a relentless pace. He raced across the island, capturing key cities and outmaneuvering German defenses. His advance was so rapid that it often caught both the enemy and his own allies off guard. He wasn't just following orders, he was constantly looking for opportunities to break the expected flow of battle. German commanders began to notice a pattern, but it wasn't one they could easily counter. Traditional warfare relied on predicting the enemy's next move, preparing defenses, and responding accordingly. But Patton disrupted that entire process. He didn't move the way they expected. He didn't wait when they thought he would pause. He didn't attack where logic suggested he should. By the time Allied forces prepared for the invasion of France, Patton's reputation had grown far beyond the battlefield. In fact, it became a weapon in itself. During Operation Fortitude, the Allies used Patton as the centerpiece of a massive deception campaign. Fake armies, inflatable tanks, and false radio signals were all designed to convince Germany that the main invasion would come at Pas-de-Calais. And at the center of this illusion was Patton, because German high command believed that if there was a major attack, he would be leading it. That belief alone reveals how deeply his image had taken hold. To the Germans, Patton wasn't just another general, he was the one most likely to strike hard and fast. Even when he wasn't moving, his presence influenced their decisions. Then came France after the D-Day landings. Once unleashed, Patton's Third Army moved with a speed that stunned both allies and enemies. He broke through defensive lines and drove deep into occupied territory, often advancing further in days than others did in weeks. His forces didn't just defeat German units, they disoriented them. Communications failed under the pressure. Commanders struggled to understand where the next attack would come from or how far it would go. Patton thrived in this chaos. In fact, he created it. He understood something that many commanders overlooked. War wasn't just about destroying the enemy's forces, it was about breaking their ability to think clearly. Every unexpected move, every rapid advance, every sudden change in direction added to the confusion. To his own soldiers, he was demanding, sometimes ruthless, but he was also effective. They knew that under his command they would move quickly and strike decisively, and that confidence translated into action on the battlefield. To the Germans, however, he became something else entirely, not just a threat, but a problem they couldn't solve. Because how do you defend against someone who refuses to follow the rules you've spent years studying? By the time the war reached its final phase, Patton's style had already reshaped the battlefield. His relentless drive, his refusal to slow down, and his ability to exploit even the smallest weakness had turned him into one of the most feared commanders of the war. And as reports of his advances continued to reach Berlin, one thing became increasingly clear to those still trying to hold the line. This was not an enemy who would stop, hesitate, or give them time to recover. This was an enemy who would keep coming, faster than expected, harder than anticipated, and always one step ahead.
By the time the war entered its final phase, fear inside the German high command was no longer driven only by overwhelming Allied numbers. It was driven by uncertainty. German officers had spent years refining their understanding of enemy tactics, building strategies around prediction, timing, and control. But now, those foundations were beginning to crack. Reports coming in from the Western Front described something far more dangerous than a conventional advance. They described confusion. At the center of that confusion was George S. Patton. His movements didn't fit established patterns. Intelligence officers tried to map his behavior, to find logic in his decisions, but the results were inconsistent. One day he would launch a rapid offensive across open ground. The next he would pivot unexpectedly, striking a weak point that had barely been identified. Traditional models of prediction began to fail. German commanders relied heavily on structure, clear lines of communication, coordinated responses, carefully timed reinforcements. But Patton's approach attacked that structure directly. His speed forced decisions to be made under pressure. Units that were supposed to hold defensive positions found themselves outflanked before they could even report contact. Entire divisions were suddenly exposed, and the officers in command struggled to respond in real time. Panic spread not because of a lack of soldiers or weapons, but because the battlefield itself seemed to defy logic. Interrogations of captured soldiers and intercepted communications only deepened the concern. Again and again, a similar picture emerged: fast-moving armored columns, relentless forward pressure, and an unwillingness to pause. German officers began to realize that they weren't just losing ground, they were losing the ability to control the pace of the battle. Every attempt to reorganize was met with further disruption, and morale started to fracture. This loss of control created a psychological effect that spread quickly through the ranks. Commanders at various levels started second-guessing their own decisions. Should they hold their positions longer or withdraw earlier? Should they reinforce a sector under attack or prepare for a breakthrough somewhere else? Even the most experienced officers felt paralyzed by the uncertainty, knowing that a single misstep could lead to disaster. Part of this fear had been carefully cultivated during Operation Fortitude. The Allies reinforced the idea that Patton would lead the main invasion force. Fake reports, deceptive radio traffic, and dummy equipment all pointed to him as the central threat. Even after the Normandy landings, many German commanders remained convinced that a larger attack under him was still coming elsewhere. This perception alone made Patton's reputation almost larger than life, shaping decisions even before he acted. Field reports became increasingly urgent. Units described being attacked before they had fully established defensive positions. Supply lines were disrupted faster than they could be repaired. Reinforcements arrived too late or were redirected to sectors that were no longer under threat. German attempts to counter this style often failed because they relied on time to regroup, to reposition, to respond. But time was exactly what Patton denied them. His continuous advance forced German forces into a reactive state, always responding, never initiating. Inside command centers, maps became outdated almost as soon as they were updated. Positions marked as secure would be overrun within hours. Planned counterattacks had to be canceled or redirected repeatedly. And with that came a harsh realization. They were no longer dictating the terms of the war. They were reacting to a commander they could not predict, fighting on a battlefield that refused to stay still. Fear of Patton's momentum had become as potent a weapon as his tanks, artillery, or soldiers, and for many German officers, it was the fear that haunted every decision.
As the Third Reich neared its final collapse, Adolf Hitler's focus had narrowed almost entirely to survival and control. Yet even in those last desperate days, accounts suggest that one Allied general occupied his thoughts more than any other: George S. Patton. According to post-war testimonies from surviving German officers, Hitler repeatedly warned that this was not a typical enemy to be outmaneuvered with conventional strategies. Patton's combination of speed, aggression, and unpredictability made him uniquely dangerous. Hitler allegedly described Patton as a commander who shattered plans before they could be executed. Where Patton moved, German defenses disintegrated, communications broke down, entire units were outflanked or encircled without warning. Officers who had survived countless battles reportedly admitted that they feared Patton more than any other Allied leader. Hitler's obsession reflected not only military calculation, but a psychological recognition of the chaos Patton could create. Reports indicate that Hitler's generals were ordered to prioritize caution whenever facing American forces in sectors where Patton might appear. This level of attention, even amid the crumbling German war machine, shows the impression Patton had made. His style wasn't just a physical threat, it was a mental one. The Germans realized that controlling him was impossible, anticipating him was almost as difficult. Decisions were paralyzed by the mere possibility of encountering his forces. Every report of his movements created tension, prompting immediate strategic recalculations. Historians debate how much of Hitler's remarks were exaggeration or legend, but multiple accounts point to a consistent theme. Patton inspired fear because he was unpredictable. He did not adhere to established tactics, often attacking where least expected, exploiting every hesitation and maintaining relentless momentum. Even minor movements of his units could ripple across German defenses, forcing them to divert resources, abandon positions, or commit to risky counterattacks. This ability to dictate the pace of battle and force opponents into reactive positions was precisely what Hitler recognized as threatening. Even as the Soviet advance pressed in from the east, it was Patton's movements in the west that dominated German strategic thinking. Hitler reportedly used Patton as the standard by which all American offensives were measured, constantly asking, "Where is Patton? What is he doing?" It was a rare instance where one general's reputation could dominate the mind of an adversary, even amid the total collapse of an empire. Fear of Patton became a form of psychological warfare, shaping German actions before a shot was even fired. Fear of Patton had practical consequences. Orders were issued to hold positions longer than strategically sound, simply to avoid appearing weak against him. Defensive lines were altered to anticipate his rapid thrusts, even when intelligence about his actual location was incomplete or outdated. German officers later admitted that this obsession disrupted rational planning, forcing resources into areas where they were less effective and leaving other sectors vulnerable. Hitler's fixation on Patton demonstrates how a single commander's methods can influence enemy strategy far beyond the battlefield. Ultimately, what Hitler allegedly recognized was more than just battlefield skill. He understood that Patton's relentless aggression, speed, and unpredictability created psychological dominance. His presence alone could unsettle experienced commanders, break cohesion, and turn pressure into panic.
In a war defined by massive armies and grand strategies, Patton had become an exceptional problem, a commander whose methods affected not just the battlefield, but the minds of those who faced him. By the time Berlin was surrounded and defeat inevitable, the German High Command was left with a sobering truth. Even in retreat, even in chaos, Patton's reputation as a commander who could strike anywhere, anytime, remained a force to be reckoned with. Hitler's warnings, whether fully accurate or partly legend, underline one essential reality. Some adversaries are not defeated solely by numbers or firepower. They are defeated by the momentum, cunning, and relentless drive of a mind that cannot be anticipated. Patton's legacy, feared by the enemy and admired by his own troops, reminds us that in war, psychological dominance can be just as decisive as tanks and guns.
By the time the Allies crossed into Germany in 1945, the momentum that George S. Patton had built throughout Europe became unstoppable. His Third Army moved with a speed and decisiveness that left German commanders scrambling to react, often too late. Entire defensive lines crumbled under his relentless pressure, not simply because of superior firepower, but because Patton had mastered the art of exploiting confusion and panic. His approach wasn't just about winning battles, it was about controlling the battlefield itself, shaping events before the enemy even had a chance to respond. Patton's advances created a psychological ripple effect across German forces. Soldiers who had survived multiple campaigns now faced a general who refused to pause, rest, or follow predictable patterns. Every rapid movement, every unexpected maneuver amplified fear and uncertainty. Commanders at every level realized that conventional planning was almost irrelevant when facing an opponent like him. Their hesitation, their second-guessing, often cost them ground they could not reclaim. Units that might have mounted a defense found themselves disoriented, unable to coordinate, and quickly overwhelmed. Even as the Reich's collapse became inevitable, Patton continued to press forward, cutting through towns and cities, liberating prisoners and taking thousands of enemy soldiers. His approach emphasized mobility over static defense, speed over caution, and relentless aggression over careful deliberation. German forces, already stretched thin and demoralized, found themselves overwhelmed not only by the size of the enemy army, but by the unpredictability and sheer audacity of Patton's methods. Reports from the front tell of units that were outflanked before they could organize, communication lines that failed under constant pressure, and entire towns falling without the expected resistance. It wasn't just military skill, it was the psychological impact of constant, unrelenting momentum. Patton's ability to maintain initiative meant that he rarely allowed the enemy time to regroup. Even small engagements were treated with the same intensity as major offensives. Quick reconnaissance, rapid armored thrusts, and decisive infantry support kept German forces off balance. Retreating units often found themselves trapped between advancing columns or cut off from their own reinforcements. By turning every action into a dynamic threat, Patton forced his opponents into a state of continuous reaction, eroding both morale and operational cohesion. In the aftermath of the war, German generals reflected on the role Patton played in the speed and decisiveness of the Allied advance. Many admitted that they had feared him more than any other Allied commander. It wasn't just his tactical brilliance that commanded respect, it was the way he turned every operation into a contest of will, forcing the enemy to react to his moves rather than initiating their own. Patton had transformed pressure into panic, and his reputation alone shaped decisions even before engagement. His campaigns demonstrated that psychological dominance could be as powerful as artillery, and that leadership could shape the course of entire battles. Patton's legacy is not only measured in the ground he captured or the battles he won, but in the lessons he imparted about momentum, initiative, and psychological dominance in warfare. He demonstrated that victory often goes to the commander who can act decisively, exploit confusion, and maintain relentless pressure.
Where others might wait, he advanced. Where others hesitated, he struck. By refusing to let the enemy recover or anticipate his moves, Patton ensured that German forces were always a step behind. By the time the war ended, Patton's campaigns had become a study in speed, decisiveness, and relentless drive. He showed that leadership on the battlefield extends beyond strategy and tactics. It is about creating situations where the enemy's mind becomes as much a target as their forces. The fear he inspired, the chaos he created, and the momentum he maintained serve as enduring examples of how one determined commander can reshape an entire campaign. In the closing chapters of World War II, Patton didn't just win battles, he reshaped the very nature of how war was fought, leaving a legacy that would be studied and revered for generations. His campaigns remain a testament to the power of aggressive initiative and the psychological edge a single commander can bring to bear on even the most formidable opponent.